From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. Today, though, is an expert series episode, which means no guest. So allow me to introduce my co-host, though, for this episode, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Yeah, I'm okay. Okay.
Just okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just commenting before, it's been a while since we've been in the studio together. I feel like I've been doing a bit more webinars and things from the studio, but we've been recording from home, I think, the last couple of episodes.
Yeah, we've had a couple of UK recordings, I think, more recently, so we needed to do the early evening our side.
Yeah. So it's only about a month away for Psych Week. You're
I know.
looking forward to that?
I am looking forward to it, yep. Much bigger Psych Week than last year.
Yeah, we've had to get a bigger boat, as they say, find a bigger room to accommodate everyone in for a couple of days of strategic work. So that'll be good fun. And then Christmas outing, which we have not informed everyone yet, I don't think on.
No, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think there's been any actual announcements.
Yeah, so we probably shouldn't announce it on the podcast.
Probably not, no.
Yeah, okay. We'll keep it a secret, just in case any of our employees listen to this podcast.
Not likely.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, it's a low risk, but
they listen to us talk all the time.
Yeah, I know, right? They can't get enough. They listen to the podcast in their own hours. Oh, what a job, right? Like, yeah, you go home and then you can listen to your boss. Like,
amazing.
I'm sure they love it. Anyway, look, the purpose of this expert series episode today is to really discuss how do we get from superficiality within psychosocial safety to something that is a bit more robust and sustainable and ultimately impactful. What I guess we're seeing a lot of across a lot of clients that we work with is there seems to be a lot of different focuses, and a lot of things just seem to be run as a once-off. Like, let's just do a risk assessment here or run a training program there. But if we ultimately want our psychosocial safety programs to be effective and continuously improve as a system, then we need to make sure that we have the right things in place. And I don't think we've ever sat down and really articulated this on a podcast or a webinar. I do feel this is probably good enough for a webinar topic as well, in which we can unpack it even further and give practical examples and takeaways. So we will do that in the coming month or so. But I think for the podcast now, I think it's probably worthwhile unpacking these things and hopefully giving the people listening a bit more of a steer around, hey, what are the essential things that we need to have in place, and how quickly can we get those things in place so that we can start moving to more of a sustainable continuous improvement mode rather than, more one-off activities. So hopefully that's enough of a frame of the problem that we're trying to address in today's discussion.
Well, I don't know. You'll have to ask the listeners if it's enough.
Okay. Does it make sense to you?
It sounds fine to me, Jason.
Okay, cool. Because I gave you probably a worse kind of framing.
You did.
When I said, when I said we should do a webinar on this or a podcast episode on this. Yep. Okay, cool. So let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start.
Oh, my goodness. Brendan wouldn't get that reference because he's never watched that movie.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
I was making all of these hilarious jokes about, like, how do you catch a wave upon the sand, and they just went straight over his head.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a deprived childhood.
I know.
Yeah.
It explains a lot.
Might have to try and fit that into Psych Week as well.
We'll make Brendan watch The Sound of Music, and we will watch Brendan watch The Sound of Music.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, okay. We could turn it into a karaoke thing.
We could. Sound of Music sing-along.
Yeah. Okay, so
now I'm definitely in.
All right, so let's get back to the topic.
Sure.
Okay.
I think what we were just talking about is much more interesting, but...
Okay, but for our listeners, maybe not so. Or maybe we've given them an idea.
I think...
Sound of Music sing-along at work. Okay, so where should organisations start to ensure their management of psychosocial safety is sustainable?
Yeah, so I think that there's lots of starting points, and a lot of that will have to do with like the readiness of the organisation, where the drivers are coming from, who's interested, who's not interested, who's actively against it, all of that sort of thing. So all of that, I think, is going to inform where you should start. So what might be a more helpful way of looking at this is if we were to imagine a company that's doing this really well and has it well embedded, what are the different elements and things that company has in place? And then, listeners can think about what might be the sensible starting point for them within that collection of things.
Yeah, it's a good way to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. So governance, I think, is a good place to start the discussion because really having governance structures in place is kind of what weaves anything into the fabric of an organisation. If you're not kind of needing to report regularly on things, and in particular if it doesn't feed into things like your corporate scorecards, a lot of those, it can be quite easy for those things to drop off the radar, to be deprioritised, that sort of thing. So establishing the governance structures is a really good way to make sure that you're embedding something and really converting it into your business as usual approaches.
Can I just say, I've had a couple of governance roles, and I think the only time, and this is going back a few years, but the only time, mental health in the workplace ever came up, or maybe getting to the point of psychosocial safety, was when we updated the risk register every couple of years and the board had to sign off on it. But it didn't do any performance kind of reporting or like how we're tracking on our safe system of work, for example. So yes, it's often missing at a board level. There is no oversight. It may come to the board level when maybe there's an improvement notice or something like that, and we need to respond to this. Have we responded? Done. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the things that we should be thinking about with regular board or periodic board reporting on this?
Yeah. So whether it's board or exec or both, I guess. What's the purpose, or what should be the purpose of that oversight? And it's really ensuring that the people who are the officers of the business, the PCBUs, that they have line of sight to different business risks and that they understand how well those risks are being controlled. That's, for me, that's kind of the core function of any governance within a business. How are we managing our risks? So, it's, I guess, around understanding what are the important metrics that should be reported back that give good information about where are our risks, what are the sources of the risks, what do we have in place to manage those, and how are we monitoring whether those, whether our approach is working or not. And tying in, I guess, the in particular, I think the effectiveness metrics are going to probably pull together a lot of other types of metrics that you're already capturing in the organisation, and looking at, what would you expect to see? Like, for example, we might expect to see turnover rates improving as we're doing a better job of managing psychosocial risk. In addition to, I guess, the more obvious things like claims and illness absences and those types of things.
So if we think about safety reporting, right, there's things like TRIFR, which I know a lot of safety professionals hate, but total recordable incident frequency rate. And then we've got things like medical treatment cases or lost time injuries, that sort of thing. A lot of lag metrics going on. And so often there's positive or lead indicators as well, like how many hazard reports are being done, how much training are we doing in this space, how many risk assessments have been conducted, that sort of thing. So thinking about psychosocial, can you give the listeners some practical examples of, what are some of the data points that they could be feeding back to the board level that would be suitable for more governance rather than operations?
Yeah, so I think, what are the key sources of psychosocial risk in the business is a really important one to feed back. And I think this, outside of the WHS laws, the Human Rights Commission 7 standards supporting the Sex Discrimination Act talks to this point quite well, in that, it's not just about understanding prevalence rates or whereabouts in the business things are occurring, but we actually need to understand what are the risk factors that are leading to these things happening, so the sources of risk. And if we can identify those well, then we can really talk to what are the upstream things that we're doing to manage these sources of risk. And, that's where we can reasonably have a conversation around, well, can we actually eliminate this source of risk or, address it at source. So I guess that's not a very specific answer, but from a principles perspective, it's probably more useful for businesses than giving a list of examples.
Well, I think some practical examples would be good, and we can give some from our own business, right? Like if we think about work overload being a risk that we know can happen in consulting, we monitor the workload of our consulting team in particular. And we have look-aheads as well about how many consulting days do we need to deliver over what time frame to make sure that we've got the right capacity to be able to do that and not take on more work than we can deliver unless we're willing to take on more staff to deliver it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good example. I think, like if you go back again to look at something like sexual harassment, we know that like sources of risk there can be, members of the public, for example, if we've got a customer service type of an organisation, then members of the public are going to be always a source of risk there from a sexual harassment perspective. The same with healthcare when you're dealing with patients as well. Transient workforces in sort of mining and petroleum tends to be a source of or a risk factor for that as well. So it's really around looking at what are the things that that can contribute to these situations arising. And role clarity obviously is a fairly common one that we see as well. Tends to be high up on the list of issues that are causing distress for people in our data sets. And so, I think that there's quite a lot that organisations can do very practically to address things like role clarity.
Yeah, and I guess maybe if you're saying that a control for role ambiguity or lack of role clarity is up-to-date job descriptions, it might be periodic review of what percentage of job descriptions have been reviewed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, potentially. I think another interesting thing that we're seeing around role clarity is it's not necessarily always the individual's own view of role clarity, but where there is inconsistent understanding of a role or the role of a team in particular. And so where the team might have a particular perspective on what its role is, but the rest of the business doesn't understand where the boundaries of that are. And so you see then sort of demands coming into that team that maybe are outside of its core delivery, but people feel obliged to still do that work. And so that often can be a source of work overload for that team. So, from that perspective, it's around, setting reasonable expectations across the business around what is this team actually responsible for, and things around like reasonable or sort of minimum response time expectations as well, so that you're not getting a request, that's asking for something 24 hours later when it's going to reasonably take you 5 days to deliver that. So I think like there's the micro stuff around position descriptions and getting those right and making sure that people understand what they are and what they're not. But then also looking at, like what's the position description of that team and how do different teams interact with each other, and how can we manage those boundaries as well.
Yeah, I guess I've probably got down into the minutiae, but what we're really talking about here, I guess, from a governance perspective is, if we're saying that we know that certain controls will manage certain hazards, what sort of oversight does your directors and your exec have that they are actually being implemented? So it's one thing to say, we've got job descriptions, but what's the review period on that, and has that actually been done?
Yeah.
And that's more the role of governance. Has that been done, rather than, actually doing it.
Yeah, definitely. So that's and again, that's around what's a reasonable level of detail to be feeding up to that level as well, and that's going to vary between organisations.
Just little tangent here.
Sure.
I just remember something that came up recently with a client where we identified one particular group that work overload was higher and lack of role clarity was an issue as well. And it was very clear in one group within that organisation that was an issue. And it turns out that the leader in that group, that role had been vacated and had not been replaced.
Yep.
So it was, really interesting to see that, again, it could be other parts of the business that are tapping into this team and there's no manager to kind of like protect them from taking on this extra work. But it could also be colleague role ambiguity, if you like, with people not really sure where the responsibilities are beginning and ending as well, because the leader's not there to direct, those activities.
Yeah, and I guess like depending on how they've managed, if they've got somebody in an acting role or how they're managing that vacant position, because that was like a C-suite position that was vacant as well. So it was quite a significant impact on the team having that particular role vacant. They'd replaced the role by the time we ran the assessment, I think, but it was a very recent appointment. So people were still feeling the absence, definitely.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but role clarity can cause significant issues. And, we need to make sure that if we do put controls in place that they are working. Any other examples, I guess, of at a governance level, what is the sort of data we should be feeding up?
Yeah, so I think like if we were to look at something like the output of a baseline risk assessment, what we would want to have established there is sort of criteria around what do we need to report up to the board and at like within what sort of a time frame. So, if we're seeing that we have, a very high level of risk in a particular group, what is our response to that need to be? So like at what level of risk does this need to be immediately escalated to the board? What do we need to include in regular reports? That sort of thing. So having some clear guidelines in place around those different sort of cutoffs and what the response needs to be for those. And we'd also be looking at sort of incidents and what needs to be reported to the board there as well. So in the same way that I guess sort of ethics and those types of things would need to be reported to the board. We can also then look at, sexual harassment, bullying types of events, psychological injuries, impacts of trauma exposures, those types of things. And again, at what point do we need to report these to the board and in what sort of a time frame?
Yeah, Wade Needham shared something recently around classification of psychosocial incidents as like class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 1 gets reported to the board, for example, whereas class 2 and class 3 don't. So I think that's actually useful, and I think it'll be worthwhile getting him maybe on the podcast at some point to talk about it. Yes, so having that sort of framework, clear triggers on what gets reported to the board when, I think is important.
Yeah, and I think also, what the board should be expecting to see there is updates on those matters as well. And so, again, what frequency they want those updates, it is going to vary depending on, I guess, the type of event and what that response is going to look like from a timeline perspective.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that all gives us a few things. Definitely, I think listeners listening to this can probably sense that a webinar would be a good way to unpack this and give some more practical guidance. So we'll definitely unpack all of these things that we're talking about today on a webinar that will happen shortly after this podcast. We'll start promoting it shortly.
Okay. Not starting to promote it right now in this episode?
Well, the promotion may even start before this episode goes out or on the same day.
Okay.
We'll find out.
Because it seems like you're promoting it now.
I always promote ahead of time.
I know you do.
Yeah. Have you heard about this thing called PHSCon? Actually, speaking of governance, we are actually going to be running a session particularly on governance at PHSCon with Wade Needham and then Chris Jones, who many listeners would know from New Zealand as well.
Yep.
So, yeah, that will be good. All
That'd
right,
be good.
so governance structures are important, but obviously not sufficient to have a sustainable psychosocial safety strategy. So, what else should we expect to see for companies that are doing this well?
Yeah, so I think understanding of ownership is very important as well, and even sort of like we'll talk about, I guess, systems of work and that sort of thing, but who owns the. So I guess we see still a lot of this ongoing debate about who owns psych health and safety, and I think that's probably not really the right question to ask. Because there's different aspects of risk ownership, right? So if we actually, if we were to say, well, who actually owns the risk of work happening, and fundamentally that's operations. But then if we look at, well, who owns risk controls, that's going to sit at different areas of the business. A lot of them are going to sit in HR, and that's, everything from sort of recruitment, performance management, training and development, that all of that kind of employee life cycle stuff, in addition to managing other types of people risk, can also be used to manage psychosocial risk. But then we'll also see, controls that might sit with legal, they might sit with IT. There's really a broad range. I mean, even things like building maintenance, right? Like if your toilets are always broken. Yeah, just thinking about a client that we did have, and the toilets were like an ongoing issue for them, and it was a source of a lot of annoyance for people.
I thought you were talking about us.
I wasn't talking about us. No, I thought about that, and then you smiled, and I was like, oh no, now he's going to think that I was talking about us, but I actually wasn't.
One time, okay, Joelle.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I wasn't talking about us. And now I've lost my train of thought. Control owners, yeah. So I guess thinking broadly about control owners, and that it can be very diverse, and it is really, what is an appropriate control for this type of hazard. And then we've got sort of the owners of the risk management cycle itself, which will tend to be your health and safety team, or it may sit with your HR team as well, depending on your business. So I think we need to get a little bit more granular when we're talking about ownership, and I think that might actually help to take the heat out of some of the debate that's been happening around that.
Yeah, what I'm seeing happen more and more is that leaders are being held responsible, or they have to take ownership of the risk for their business unit or their team. Depends on the size of your organisation, right? Like how far that goes down. But I think GM ownership, when you've got separate business units, for example, is great. And then if you've done a risk assessment with them and they are much higher than the rest of the business, then they're responsible for bringing that down, and then bringing in HR, health and safety, OD, whoever they need to help implement controls to bring their risk level down. So they won't necessarily know how to do that themselves, but then to know who to reach out to go, hey, look, we've got risk here. Let's do something about it. I need some support.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what we should be seeing, is that, those controls are established, or, maybe they're not, maybe they're missing, and the control owner needs to actually establish something there. But then, what we should really see is the control owner providing that assistance to operations to be able to properly implement those controls.
Yeah, and I think that's when more mature companies have a clear understanding of risk, and things like our overall risk score now that we give on the back of a risk assessment make it very clear to determine, a threshold for risk. What is something that we're willing to accept versus something we're not willing to accept, and when will we put pressure on, say, GMs to actually go and do something. Like, this is out of appetite, you need to do something, bring in those functional teams to support.
Yeah, and I think that also talks to response at the operational level as well, and what is our, in addition to at what threshold do we need to act, also then at what threshold, what are our monitoring intervals for different thresholds. So, if we're seeing a high risk group, that might warrant a 3-monthly sort of monitoring assessment to see, are things getting worse? Have we stabilized? Have we started to reduce? And then again, once we get past that threshold, then maybe it's a 6-monthly check-in. And, if we're in that low risk, then it's a maybe 12 or 18-month just sort of ongoing monitoring. So I think, it is really important to have that, that the baseline is important as a starting point, but from that, then you really want to develop or to establish your monitoring strategies that are risk-based. Yep. Rather than just saying, yes, this is the frequency that we're going to do this. It does need to be responsive to risk profiles in the business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit different to an engagement survey cycle where you might just say, hey, look, we're going to run an annual survey every year or two, and we're going to have pulse surveys every quarter in between because we just want to have a finger on the pulse of like employee sentiment. This is about understanding where risk of harm exists and then making sure that we're responsive to that to prevent people from becoming unnecessarily ill.
Yeah, and it is, I always talk about it being like rust, right? Like, so it's like your fabric maintenance strategy. We know that there's the potential for rust to be there, so we need to do regular inspections. If we find rust, we need to evaluate it. How bad is it? Do we need to remediate right now, or can we monitor? If we can monitor, how frequently do we need to monitor based on the level of risk that it poses?
So just a thought that's going through my head at the moment is, when is it best for a company to set kind of their procedure then for re-administration of a risk assessment based on risk profiles? Is it better to do that before they do their first baseline risk assessment survey across an organisation? Or should they wait until afterwards and then go, well, this is what we're going to do?
Well, it probably depends on what type of data they're going to get out of their assessment and how well that lends itself to informing a understanding of risk. I guess from a principal's perspective, you should really have those expectations in place before you do your baseline. Because you're basically setting out the rules in advance and saying, well, this is, from a principal's perspective, if harm is in this level of severity, then we must act.
Which ideally then you're having that session with the board first and explaining the metrics that you're going to use and getting their risk appetite, down and agreement on response.
If that's necessary, I mean, the other thing that you can do is align it with your kind of existing approach to risk management and your existing thresholds for risk management in the business. If you do have sort of well-established risk management processes and thresholds already.
Yeah, and we've had some conversations recently, right, with clients who are looking at their other kind of hygiene exposure processes and trying to align to that for things like noise and dust and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think, what we often see at that enterprise risk register level is that they will kind of they'll have their 5 levels of risk, but then they'll have sort of the different categories at each of those levels as well. So they will include sort of reputation and environment and finance as well as safety, and kind of try to get those thresholds aligned across each type of risk.
Yeah. Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. Okay, so where are we up to, Joelle? Process ownership.
Yes, process ownership. So we've talked about risk owners. We've talked about the importance of control owners collaborating with risk owners to implement controls well. And then we've talked about, I guess, the risk management cycle, and that's kind of the process ownership that we're going to talk about now. So generally this sort of thing starts with policy, and the policy document is sort of the place where you would expect to see expectations from the board and exec outlined in terms of how do we expect the business to perform in this matter. So policy is a really important starting point, but again, not sufficient, necessary but not sufficient. So what we need to see sitting beneath that is systems of work. And, we can caveat that by talking about the limitations of admin controls and that sort of thing. And procedures are only as good as the people implementing them. But they're still necessary, right? Like you do need to have those things in place that tell people, well, this is the process that we're following. This is how we're going to manage this risk. For you in your role, whatever that might be, here are where the expectations are for you. Here are the tools and processes that you can tap into to help you do whatever it is that you're responsible for doing. So, the procedures really give us sort of the map of how we're going to do this and how we're going to do it well. And they create that opportunity for repeatable processes fundamentally. What we really need there is those things like your procedures, your work instructions, your internal standards and those types of things. And what we really want to see from those is that capture of, well, how do we identify and respond to psychosocial risk? Those thresholds that we were talking about, that tends to be, or that would probably be where we would define those thresholds, would be in that suite of documents. So what are our different levels of response or control necessary for those different thresholds, and then what are the monitoring strategies that we're going to have in place, and how do we tie those monitoring strategies back into to feed our governance reporting content, I guess, and feeding into the corporate scorecard as well. So really those monitoring strategies should be able to tell us whether our risk management activities are both occurring and having the effect that we're expecting.
Yeah. How would that typically be documented and communicated around the organisation?
Well, because I guess you'd have your standard risk management procedure, which would say like this is how often we're going to do an org-wide assessment, for example. It would also talk about when you might need to do a situational or a team-based assessment. They'd talk about different thresholds and that sort of thing. They would outline the process to follow to conduct that assessment if you're the ops manager or the GM or whoever it is that needs to do it. So giving that source of information to operations so that they know what to do, how to do it, when to do it, that sort of thing. We'd also see in there, I guess, auditing requirements. And so, for internal auditing or external, if that's what the business is doing, that would be where that would be captured. And those reports, I guess that's the findings is the audit report, and then how that is disseminated through the business. It's going to be the same as your other types of comm strategies around those types of reports. And again, those are going to feed up to your board and exec, feed through to the teams who need to know about it, and then it might be just kind of a, on your standard all hands, these are the audits that we've done broadly across the business kind of thing.
So if we think about triggers for conducting risk assessments, there's some legal ones that are outlined in the codes of practice for psychosocial. What would typically trigger a psychosocial risk assessment outside of your normal kind of global survey across the organisation, as well as like your monitoring for the high risk groups?
Yeah, so these are actually captured in the, not specifically in the psychosocial regs, but just in the general regs for how to manage hazards, which are then referenced in the psychosocial regs. Yeah. So it is, I guess, the specific conditions are around, so if a health and safety rep requests it, when it becomes apparent that controls are not working as intended, when there's a change happening, what else? I think those are the big ones.
Yeah, and that's
when
one
workforce consultation indicates that it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think most large organisations have had some sort of restructure in the last year or two, with different market conditions and all the rest. I seldomly see that actually prompts a risk assessment, whereas that's actually, obviously enshrined in legislation that is one of the triggers for a risk assessment.
Yeah, definitely. And so what we, from a psychosocial perspective, what we would ideally be seeing there is a baseline being done in advance of that change, or even in advance of the change being announced, right? Because oftentimes just knowing that the change is coming is going to have a significant impact on people's distress levels. And, if we're doing regular baselines as well, then that might be a better approach to take than just randomly doing a baseline out of sync, which might just flag to people that there's something going on as well. So there's all that kind of stuff to think about. But yeah, if we have sort of a fairly up to date baseline, then what we're able to do is introduce that more intensive monitoring strategy during the period of change, so that we can actually keep a good sense of where are the levels of psychosocial risk in the affected areas of the business, where do we need to intervene and either provide more support or do something differently.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably warrants its own webinar, because org change and restructures are just so commonplace, and we just don't see an understanding or a consideration of the people risk associated with those changes much, if at all.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like you say, some important things to consider there. Make sure you've got a baseline risk assessment before the change is announced. And then more regular monitoring. Don't just stick to annual monitoring during change, because obviously you want to keep your finger on the pulse and be able to respond quickly as required within certain parts of the business as they need it.
Yep. Yeah, and again, that gives that assurance back to the exec that, yes, we're aware of the risks that are being introduced here, and we are across those.
Yep. I've had some discussions with some private equity groups around measuring psychosocial risks and monitoring them during times of M&A, but often that's already begun and been announced and all the rest. So, yeah, getting the baseline in place beforehand is probably better practice.
Better practice, but if you don't have one, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't.
Monitor.
Yeah.
Oh, we missed the boat, so we're just not going to do anything.
Yeah, we're just not going to check at all.
So, there's some really good practical things there. And again, yeah, I think we'll need to unpack that on a webinar in more detail. Cool. I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about was around investigations. Obviously, it's a key point of collaboration between health and safety and HR, given the overlapping duties between, the Respect to Work stuff under the Sex Discrimination Act amendments, as well as the Workplace Health and Safety regs. So how do you see that working when companies are doing this well?
How do I imagine it working?
So, okay. Yeah. We have not seen this done well yet.
No. I mean, we've seen...
People are starting to work towards it.
Yeah, we've seen, I guess, examples of better practice, but it's very much a work in progress for, I think every company that we've looked at this stage. So I guess primarily, again, it comes back to, do we have systems in place that talk about how we're going to respond to these incidents? So whether they're psychological injuries, whether they're sort of critical incident type situations, or more sort of related to conduct matters, being clear about how we're going to respond when those things happen. Also, how are we going to detect them, right? Are we just relying on people reporting, or are we going to use other methods to detect when these things are happening? And maybe that's also going to inform what our response is going to be. And so I think we need to see a good level of flexibility in the response, that how that response, or the steps involved in that response, should really be able to be moderated based on the situation, and, really leaning into those principles of being person-centered and trauma-informed, that we need to be able to adjust our approach for the needs and desires of the people who are involved at the time, and actually what's going to serve them best. And so there is, I guess, that balance between serving the interests of the people involved while also managing business risk. And we're better off trying to think about those things in advance and get a good idea of how we are actually going to balance that, how we're going to manage that, rather than trying to figure it out while we're in the middle of potentially a very distressing situation that we're trying to manage. So I guess, clarity around how we're going to respond, and the flexibility in how we can respond, but then also really clear around what are the collaboration expectations between the different teams there. So again, there's a role for the safety team, there's a role for the HR team, and being clear around, what that looks like from a roles and responsibilities perspective, from an investigation ownership perspective, but again, going back to those sort of principles of being trauma informed, ideally what we would want to see is collaboration between those two teams in a single investigation rather than running multiple investigations. And then what do we see as an outcome of those investigations? We really want to be, wherever feasible, looking at, what are the upstream things that we can do. I guess taking more of a human factors type of a lens to an investigation to look at, what were the performance shaping factors and how can we intervene at that factors level, again, to prevent this type of thing potentially recurring.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Just yesterday I had one of my health and safety friends who is doing a process review on their investigations approach, and he commented that he's like, did you know that HR people don't do a root cause analysis when they do an investigation? Like, yes.
Yeah, we did know that.
So there's some easy wins if HR can leverage the insights of how health and safety go about responding once an incident has occurred from a health and safety perspective, not just substantiating did someone fall off that ladder, but what led to that happening.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've talked a bit about investigation, so probably don't want to go into too much detail on this.
No, I was thinking we haven't actually done a podcast on it though, have we? So we might. It might be worth getting Heather on, maybe.
Yeah, we did a webinar, but not a podcast. You're right. Yes, so we should do a podcast episode. We will
with Heather.
Yeah, there we go. Just stopped you in, Heather. Glad you're listening in your own time again. And then finally, I guess education is the last thing we wanted to talk about. So where does psychosocial education fit in this?
Yeah, so I mean, it ties in with sort of the roles and responsibilities bit, right? Like people need to know what's expected of them. There's definitely some content knowledge that needs to come along with that as well, right? Because I think, what we see a lot of the time, and, I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, is that anchoring around, that mental health is inside the individual. And so for leaders to be able to really understand what their job is, they need to understand the relationship between work and mental health, and actually, sort of be able to see what their role is in that, they're not being a counsellor, but they're actually there to look for sources of risk in the workplace and manage those sources of risk for their team. So that does come with education, and then, for at a workforce level as well, as with any type of risk management activity, there's necessarily education that comes along with that. So I think there's stuff around, you would probably from a system perspective want to look at like a competency framework or something like that, and really be clear about, what are the learning outcomes that we would expect to have established with different roles in the business and different levels of the business. And then, from an activities perspective, what is it that we're expecting coming out of that competency framework? What are the actions that we're expecting to see people perform as a consequence of having done that education? And again, tying that back into our controls, right? And making sure that we do actually have controls in place so that people, if a leader is trained in a risk management process, that they've actually got the tools there that they need to be able to use to engage properly in that risk management process. As we've talked about a few times, not doing the education too early in the piece, or maybe starting with some broad awareness and the introduction of a timeline of when we're going to expect leaders to start being more active in this space. But that should really only happen when we've got those the procedures and the tools to help leaders do what they need to do.
Yeah. So summarising that, there's some key things there, right? So clear learning objectives, clear kind of behaviours or actions that we want people to be able to do following the training beyond just knowing a little bit more about what's a psychosocial hazard. Being able to use tools if they're available. And I guess hazard reporting probably fits in there as well, right?
That's one of the things. And I guess it's it's one of the actions that you would be expecting across the business once they've been through that education is, how do I know if something is a hazard, and if so, how do I report it? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably a key thing that I'm seeing is a missed opportunity at the moment. Many organisations are just, doing, I don't want to call it the bare minimum. I think it is something and it makes sense to do, and that is to leverage existing kind of minor physical hazard reporting processes for psychosocial, and then maybe adding a confidentiality layer on that so it goes to health and safety director rather than to a line manager. But we're seeing that not many hazard reports are coming in. So you still want, I guess you want to continue to do your kind of global risk assessments and your more regular monitoring in high risk areas, and obviously trigger-based risk assessments as well. But then you also want to kind of encourage reporting outside of those formal kind of risk assessments. So how can companies do that more effectively, I think is, we've got some ideas, but it's a nut that still needs to be cracked for most organisations.
Yeah, because currently it seems like it's either you're adding in like a psychosocial category into your minor hazard reporting, or it's going to HR as a grievance report, and neither of those is really a good fit.
Yeah. Talking about education, if we've got processes like that and we want to encourage people to use them, then that would be a good time to make sure we've got all this stuff established first, and then we train people at the same time rather than just doing basic awareness training.
Yep.
But I think people listening to this episode will understand that we can probably give some more specific things about what does really good practice look like. What does the gold standard, the Joelle standard look like? I think we'll do that in a webinar.
Is that going to be the name of it?
The Joelle standard.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I don't like that.
All right. Well, I think, what people are really desperate for and craving for is real specific guidance. I think there's some very good generic guidance out there around these are the sort of things that look good, but what are some like hard and fast kind of things that we could make strong recommendations internally?
Yeah. The challenge is that it's difficult to give generic guidance that's also specific.
Yeah, that's right. So if we can be very specific, I think, and then people go, well, how does this fit in our context? It's a bit easier than being too generic and then people not being able to see how it might fit in.
Yeah, ideally.
Moving on.
The response that I get from people then is, that's not going to work for us.
Yeah. We just need to be clear up front in the comms, like this might not work for you, but then think about how you would
You do the work.
That.
Think about it. Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, hopefully you found that conversation hopefully resembled and resembled something of usefulness.
Worth 40 minutes of your time.
But we are using this podcast, I guess, to promote the webinar that we'll be doing, which is free for internal people and safety professionals.
Yes.
So hopefully see some of you there, and we'll give you some very practical guidance and some takeaways that hopefully you can action and contextualize to make sure it does actually work in your context. Yeah, beautiful.
Good.
Now, remember, listeners, because that now brings us to the end of this episode, that we do record these over video. So if you want to see any of our videos, and we've got now hundreds of these things, right, across our various podcast channels on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. You'll also find snippets of these episodes on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page, so follow along there. And while you're on LinkedIn, go check in with Joelle and myself. Connect with us if you haven't already, because we'd love to continue the conversation over that medium. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.